The disappearance of 17-year-old Valerie Tindall sent shockwaves through the small community of Rushville, Indiana in June 2023. Valerie, a fun-loving and well-liked teen known for her vibrant personality, became the focus of an Amber Alert after she disappeared without a trace. For months, her family and friends were gripped by fear and uncertainty, desperate for answers. In November 2023, their worst fears were realized when Valerie's body was discovered, buried on the property of her neighbor and former employer, Patrick Scott. The location of her remains, just steps from the home where she had spent her childhood, added an unbearable layer of heartache to the tragedy. According to police reports, Scott admitted to choking Valerie with a belt, claiming she was trying to blackmail him. His chilling confession has left as many questions as answers, plunging the community into a state of grief and disbelief. But what happened before her tragic death? This is the Valerie Tindall murder case. Valerie Tindall was a 17-year-old student at Rushville Consolidated High School, a young woman with a heart full of dreams and a personality that could light up any room. Valerie was known for her bright smile and loved the things that brought her joy: video games, singing, and animals. Her dream was to one day become a veterinarian, a passion fueled by her deep compassion for all living things. Her parents, Sheena Sandifer and Jack Tindall, were looking for peace after years in the city. They moved to Arlington, Indiana, seeking solace in the quiet charm of this small town. The promise of a slower pace, fresh air, and a community that embraced them felt like the perfect escape. They weren't just looking for a house, they were looking for a home, a place where they could heal and start over. But they didn't know that across the street from the Tindalls lived Patrick Scott, a 59-year-old man who ran a local lawn care business in the Maplewood neighborhood. At first, he seemed like an ordinary neighbor, someone you would wave at as you passed, someone who was part of the community. But as time passed, something sinister began to happen, something that would turn this once safe city upside down. Patrick Scott, the neighbor they thought they knew, would be the start of a nightmare from which they would never come out. Everything started to fall apart on Wednesday, June 7th, 2023. Valerie had told her mother, Sheena, that she was going to work, but something didn't feel right. Valerie didn't normally work on Wednesdays. Pushing her growing discomfort aside, Sheena told herself that maybe her daughter was just hanging out with friends. Mother didn't think much about it at the moment. But when Scott later told Sheena that Valerie hadn't shown up for work that day, she felt a chill. Her heart sank, and her stomach churned into worries. What followed was the beginning of a mother's worst nightmare. Sheena reached out desperately, trying to figure out where Valerie might be. But the more she talked to Scott, the more inconsistencies she discovered in his story. His answers were vague, evasive, and seemed to change every time she asked him for details. Her mother's instincts was telling her that something was wrong. But the breakthrough came when one of Scott's clients revealed a crucial detail: a lunch meeting between Scott and Valerie. This new information hit Valerie's mother like a cold wave as it confirmed her worst suspicions. The pieces began to fall into place, and Valerie's mother knew she had to act quickly to find out the truth. In the quiet town of Arlington, Indiana, a nightmare unfolded that would destroy a family's lives forever. Valerie Tindall, a smart 17-year-old girl, had disappeared without a trace. Her parents, Sheena and Jack, could only imagine the worst. When they called the Rush County Sheriff's Department, they knew they couldn't sit back and wait. The department immediately took Valerie's case seriously and launched an intensive investigation. It wasn't just that Valerie had disappeared, there were signs that something much more sinister had happened. Authorities quickly began tracking her movements through phone records and bank accounts. They worked tirelessly, hoping to find even one clue to bring her home. But little did they know, Valerie's fate was already sealed. On the day she disappeared, Valerie was at the home of Patrick Scott, a man she and her family trusted. But what started as a disagreement quickly turned into violence. In a moment of fear, Patrick Scott strangled Valerie with his belt, silencing her bright future forever. He then wrapped her lifeless body in black plastic, as if she were nothing more than a discarded object. But that wasn't the end of the horror. Patrick Scott didn't call for help. He showed no remorse. Instead, he went back to his family and tried to spend his night as if nothing had changed. The next day, he built a primitive wooden box, placed Valerie inside and sealed it. He then drove her body to a remote part of his property, less than 100 yards from her own home, and buried her in the ground. For 5 agonizing months, Valerie's family endured the torment of not knowing where she was. Her 18th birthday came and went with no sign of her, and each passing day brought more heartache. What had happened to their daughter? Had she run away? Or was something much more sinister going on? The search continued, led by the Rushville Police Department, the Shelby County Sheriff's Office, and the United States Marshals. Hundreds of acres were searched, all based on digital footprints left by a phone Scott had bought for Valerie. Each clue brought them closer to the truth, and to the devastating discovery that would leave a community in turmoil. The truth, when it finally came to light, was more chilling than anyone could have imagined. Valerie's family would never be the same again. And as they stood on the edge of a grief too deep to comprehend, they knew the nightmare had only just begun. The investigation ran through an inconvenient truth. Patrick Scott had access to remote areas through his landscaping business, which gave him the opportunity to hide and deceive the police. The search seemed endless and suspiciously complex, but the Rush County Sheriff's Office didn't give up. Determined to buy the truth, she obtains more than 50 search warrants. Tension rose when cadaver dogs were deployed. They were led to a property with a pond close to Scott's home, and the sense of relief barely matched the similarities, as the dogs clearly detected the presence of human remains in the water. This was a breakthrough, but it wasn't enough. The search went on. On November 28, 2023, this trail led to a new discovery. The police conducted a similar aerial search of Scott's extensive grounds and found several places where the ground had been disturbed. 6 months had passed since Valerie Tindall disappeared without a trace. It was a period of inevitability and pain for her family, who waited every minute for answers. The police continued to search tirelessly, determined to reveal the truth. That determination would finally pay off. One day, during simultaneous searches of multiple locations in the region, including Patrick Scott's home and a property he owned, investigators were repeatedly confronted with a gruesome discovery. As they make their way onto the ground, they encountered a disturbance, a clue that something was hidden. The soil was removed, revealing 2 hives buried close together. The police couldn't believe what they saw. In one of the closets, Valerie's body lay, silent and unrecognizable by time, but her orange nail polish proved to be the ultimate proof. It was a moment when the air seemed to press powerfully, filling the room with a relaxing silence. Valerie's family, in the depths of their grief and confrontation, had to confront the true nature of her disappearance. It was a pain beyond words, the void of not knowing that slowly consumed them. And then came the interrogation of Patrick Scott, the man who had told them so much, the man who had used his smile as a friendly. The officer knew this moment could change everything. As Patrick Scott sat across from him, developing what was to come, the officer began with soft, almost friendly words. "Patrick," he said calmly, his voice soft but loaded with meaning, Over the past 5 months, you and I have met many times. You have seen me many times, right?" His words came slowly, deliberately, as he searched Scott's eyes, trying to make sense of it. "Yes, that's right, Scott," his gaze vague, even not fully understanding where this conversation was going. It was June 7th, a day that slowly unfolded into a nightmare. After months of searching, we got closer to the truth. They found the box, a box hidden behind your shed. In that box was Valerie, carefully wrapped and taped. Patrick probably had thought they could never find her, but they did find her. We found her in the box you bought yourself. The same box that the porn videos were hidden in, the same box. And as he sat there, crying and struggling with his emotions, he knew that the police knew everything already. You can no longer pass the blame. The agents have everything. The evidence was too heavy to be stable. Patrick didn't have no choice but to face the truth. The tension in the room was at this very moment. You can feel the pressure. The officer told him that he didn't have much more time left. The officers had spotted Patrick, and it is now up to him to explain what happened that day. "Why? Why did you do this? Why put her in that box?" The officer looked at Patrick Scott, determined but without aggression. This was the moment when everything could change. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. Patrick knew it. He could feel it. The evidence was overwhelming. What happened? When Patrick got home the next day, he decided to make that box. And what about the hole? The hole had already been made in advance. Not because he exists in concrete, but for another reason. He knew something had to be done, so Patrick was prepared. So Patrick strangled Valerie. Patrick was standing there, breathing heavy, and his heart was pounding in his chest. Valerie stood in front of him, her eyes full of determination, her words sharp and charged. She had him in her grasp, her words as a messenger cutting deep into you. "I'm going to tell everyone that you influenced me to be too fashionable," she said, her voice full of contempt. "If you don't want that, I know how to cause trouble." His hand went to his belt. It happened so quickly you didn't even realize it. The buckle more attractive as you undid it, the sound sharp in the stuffy room. Valerie stood there, her eyes full of hatred, and he knew there was no stopping her. He gripped the belt, the long leather band that normally dissolved around your pants and limited around her neck. Her eyes flashed from shock to panic, but there was no more loss. He pulled harder and harder until her breath hitched. The room was now silent. All he heard was his own breathing, heavy and rough, as he looked at her. Valerie's body hung limp, her face pale, her eyes motionless. His hands shook as you let go of the strap, like some kind of release, but the weight of what you had just done pressed hard on your shoulders. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Patrick looked at the belt on the floor. It was nothing more than a simple piece of leather, but he realized what he had done. His employee, his neighbor. "What have I done?" He stood there, Patrick, in the silence of the room, and he looked at Valerie. It starts to break through him more and more. This was no longer an argument that got out of hand. This was something much more serious. This was the moment everything changed. He took her life. Valerie's parents believed that Linda Scott, Patrick's wife, knew about her murder. It was maybe the first week, just after they ruled out flyers, when she noticed something strange. It was day 2, and they went to the neighborhood to hand out flyers. When they got home, the flyers were already gone, and Linda kept asking if everything was okay. They kept reassuring them, telling them over and over again that Valerie would definitely be fine and would be home soon. How anyone can do otherwise is incomprehensible to them. Valerie's parents cast Patrick as a monster, but Linda, his wife, must also be held responsible. They are now sure that they know everything. The whole family knew what was going on. Valerie was Patrick's employee, but he saw her as much more than just work. He paid her, gave her money, food, gas, and even trips she wanted to take. Valerie Soto's case calls on us to be vigilant, to protect our children from the unknown dangers that often hide in the shadows of normal, everyday relationships. It's a tragic reminder of the value of communication and the importance of preserving